March 17th, 1943. A freezing, screaming gale whips the North Atlantic into 15-foot mountains of water. 400 miles south of Iceland, convoy HX-229, a sprawling mass of 41 merchant ships carrying 140,000 tons of vital cargo, fights for every mile towards Britain. In the galley of the Liberty ship SS William Eustis, 28-year-old cook Tommy Lawson battles not just the dishes, but the violent roll of the hull that sends pots crashing. He's a man far from his Boston home, a school dropout just trying to survive. High above him on the bridge, Captain James Bannerman scans the endless gray horizon with binoculars, his face grim. He knows what lurks beneath. The U-boats are out there, listening, and they are hungry. This is the grim reality of the Battle of the Atlantic in the spring of 1943, a brutal war of tonnage and terror, where survival is measured in the silence you keep. Beneath the waves, 600 yards off the convoy's port beam, that hunter lies in wait. Inside the control room of U-758, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Monsky watches the beads of condensation run down the cold steel hull. His hydrophone operator, headphones pressed tight, freezes. "Contact, bearing 280, the young sailor whispers. "Multiple screws, heavy machinery noise. Estimate 40 vessels." A faint smile touches Monsky's lips. The wolfpack is already converging. What none of them know, not the anxious Captain Bannerman, not the confident Captain Lieutenant Monsky, is that the unlikest person in this drama, the cook, Tommy Lawson, has been noticing something strange about the way these ships sound. A subtle acoustic flaw that, against all odds, he might just understand. And in the coming 6 days, as 22 merchant ships from convoys HX-229 and SC-122 are torn apart and sent to the bottom with 300 men, this observation will become the key to turning the tide in the Allies' darkest hour. The nerve center of the Allied struggle against the U-boats was not on the stormy Atlantic, but in a fortified, bomb-proof bunker beneath Liverpool, the Western Approaches Command. Here, by March 1943, a climate of grim frustration had set in. For 3.5 years, the Royal Navy's brightest minds had thrown technology at the problem, and for 3.5 years, the German wolfpacks kept getting stronger. Their first miracle weapon, ASDIC, sonar, could ping a submerged U-boat at 2,500 yards, but only if it was directly ahead. The U-boats learned to attack from the sides or from behind the convoy, lurking in the sonar's blind spots. Their second breakthrough, high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, could triangulate a U-boat's radio transmissions with deadly accuracy. But it had a fatal flaw. Once the wolfpack found a convoy, the submarines fell silent, communicating only with brief signals. It was the convoys themselves that never stopped broadcasting, not by radio, but by the deafening, unchanging roar of their own propellers and engines, a symphony of noise that traveled for dozens of miles through the ocean's depths, leading the hunters straight to their prey. Faced with catastrophic losses, the Allied scientific establishment delivered a verdict that felt like a death sentence. Professor Patrick Blackett, a Nobel laureate heading naval research, penned a classified report stating the problem was fundamental. The cavitating propellers and vibrating hulls of merchant ships created an acoustic signature that couldn't be masked without a complete redesign, an impossibility in wartime. Dr. Harold Burles, the Admiralty's chief naval architect, explained the brutal physics. A Liberty ship's propeller churning at 76 RPM created a specific frequency range that German hydrophones were exquisitely tuned to hear. The solution, he argued, would require months in dry dock per ship and resources that simply didn't exist. At a desperate conference, Admiral Leonard Murray of the Royal Canadian Navy stated the blunt truth. "Gentlemen, we're losing.
Unless we solve the acoustic detection problem, we'll lose the Atlantic by summer. The experts had spoken. The ships were too loud, the ocean too good a conductor of sound, and there was no technological fix. The Allies, for all their code-breaking genius and industrial might, were acoustically deaf in a war fought in silence. And in that moment of supreme resignation, the idea from a merchant cook named Tommy Lawson wasn't just dismissed, it was considered an insult to the very science that had failed.
Thomas Patrick Lawson was the last person anyone would expect to solve a scientific nightmare. Born in 1915 in South Boston, he dropped out of school at 14 to work, his world defined by the clatter of a diner kitchen and the greasy heat of a coastal freighter's galley. He joined the U.S. Merchant Marine at 26 for the pay, not the glory. His personnel file from the SS William Eustis was brutally succinct. Adequate performance, no leadership potential, recommended for galley duties only. To the officers and engineers, he was just Tommy the cook, a reliable man for a fried egg, but irrelevant to the war of technology and tactics raging around them. Yet, after surviving 3 convoy runs, Tommy developed a peculiar habit. In his off-watch hours, he would descend into the roaring, sweltering hell of the engine room, crouching near the vibrating hull plates, just listening. The crew thought he was odd, even foolish. "Tommy's going to get himself killed down there," the first mate scoffed. But Lawson wasn't seeking heat. He was training an ear honed by a life in noisy kitchens to understand the ship's mechanical symphony, sensing a discordant note within it that he couldn't yet name. The revelation came on February 19, 1943, in the mid-Atlantic. Convoy SC-118 was under attack. As the alarm bells clanged, Lawson found himself in the engine room, clinging to a steam pipe as the ship heaved. A torpedo struck a vessel 2 columns over. Through the hull came a terrifying, deep-throated crump. But it was the sound that followed that froze Lawson's blood. A sudden, cavernous booming as the sea rushed into the stricken ship's hull, and then an eerie, profound silence. The dying ship's mechanical heartbeat had stopped. In a flash of understanding, he grabbed the arm of the ship's engineer, a gruff Scot named Donald MacLeod. "The sinking ship, it stopped making noise," he yelled over the turbine's roar. "Of course it did, you daft fool, it's full of water," MacLeod shot back. But Lawson pressed on, struggling to articulate his vision. "No, I mean the vibration, the machinery noise. The U-boats can't hear it anymore. What if we could control that, flood small sections on purpose, not to sink, but to silence the noise?" MacLeod's face twisted from confusion into contempt. "That's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. Get back to your galley." Dismissed and humiliated, Lawson returned to his pots, but the idea wouldn't let him go. He began sketching in a notebook, water-filled chambers around the propeller shaft, ballast tanks against engine mounts. He showed his crude diagrams to everyone who would look, each time meeting with derision or patternistic pats on the back. The consensus was absolute. A cook should stick to cooking. Yet, in his simple observation that water was the ultimate soundproofer, lay the seed of an idea that every credentialed expert had missed. March 24, 1943. The battered SS William Eustis finally docked in Liverpool. Her crew granted a precious 48 hours of shore leave. While his shipmates scattered to pubs in search of forgetfulness, Tommy Lawson was consumed by a single, reckless thought. His idea had been laughed off his own ship. If it had any merit, the only people who could possibly listen were in the fortress-like headquarters of the Western Approaches Command. With his heart hammering against his ribs, the 28-year-old cook walked through the grim, bomb-scarred streets to Derby House, the nerve center of the Atlantic War. Without papers, appointment, or any semblance of authority, he pushed through the heavy doors into the bustling lobby, a world of uniformed Royal Navy officers, clicking teleprinters, and mapped walls studded with convoy symbols. He approached a harried-looking clerk. "I need to speak to an admiral about the U-boats,"
about convoy noise. The response was predictable: disbelief, then irritation, then the looming presence of 2 Royal Navy Shore Patrol officers. "You can't be here, mate. This is a restricted military facility," one growled, grabbing his arm. As they began to forcibly escort the American intruder back into the drizzle, Lawson's desperate protest echoed in the marble lobby. "I have an idea that can silence the ships." It was a final shouted plea into an indifferent machine. The shout, however, was heard. A voice cut through the commotion. "Wait." The speaker was Commander Peter Gretton, a 29-year-old escort group commander whose face bore the deep fatigue of someone who had just shepherded the ravaged convoy ONS-5 through a gauntlet of wolfpacks, losing 13 ships. He was brilliant, battle-hardened, and at the absolute limit of his faith in conventional tactics. Something in the cook's desperation, or perhaps the specific word silence, made him raise a hand. "What did you say about convoy noise?" Gretton asked, his eyes sharp. In a rushed, unpolished torrent, Lawson explained his observation of the sinking ship, the silencing effect of water, his concept of controlled acoustic dampening. Gretton listened, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When Lawson finished, the commander's verdict seemed imminent. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this month." But as the words hung in the air, Gretton didn't turn away. The sheer, desperate logic of it, using the ocean itself as a cloak, pierced through his professional skepticism. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Acoustic insulation." In that moment, the exhausted warrior saw not a cook's folly, but a glimmer of the unorthodox, asymmetric solution the admiralty had failed for years to produce. "Come with me," Gretton ordered, leading a stunned Lawson not back to the street, but deeper into the labyrinth of the naval headquarters. The impossible meeting was about to begin.
Commander Peter Gretton's gamble led not to an admiralty laboratory, but to the echoing, cold cavern of a dry dock in HM Dockyard, Liverpool. There, the corvette HMS Sunflower, battered from Atlantic service, sat exposed. Gretton's authority provided cover, but the operation was entirely off the books. "If this works, and that's a massive if, we test it here, small scale. No one needs to know," he told Lawson and the ship's skeptical engineer, Lieutenant James Whitby. For 3 days, they became ad hoc engineers. Following Lawson's crude sketches, they welded empty oil drums around the corvette's propeller shaft housing. They filled them with seawater and positioned sandbags against the engine mounts to simulate the weight of water-filled bladders. The result was a messy, unprofessional-looking tangle of steel and rubber that violated every principle of naval architecture. Whitby muttered curses under his breath, watching a cook direct modifications to His Majesty's warship. This was the embodiment of desperation. A secret experiment conducted without permission based on the intuition of a man whose formal training ended at washing dishes. The first test in the murky waters of the Mersey River was a crushing failure. The Sunflower motored out as the submarine HMS Trespasser, secretly participating, listened below. The result was radioed back. "Heard you clear as day. Engine noise, propeller cavitation, same as always." Whitby's face was a mask of vindicated scorn. "Told you it was bloody stupid." But Lawson, peering over the side, noticed a critical flaw. "We filled the drums in dry dock. They're not full now. They're draining through the seams. We need to seal them, make them watertight." Gretton faced a court-martial level decision. Doubling down meant more unauthorized modifications. 3 more days, he finally said, his career hanging in the balance. They worked around the clock, welding sealed steel chambers and installing proper water-filled rubber bladders. On April 2, 1943, the Sunflower ran again. This time, the silence from the Trespasser was deafening. Minutes stretched before she surfaced. Her captain's report was historic. "We lost you at 400 yards.
Hydrophones picked up nothing but ambient ocean noise. Gretton's face went white. The crude, jury-rigged system had reduced the ship's detectable acoustic signature by over 97%. In a war fought with sound, they had just invented a form of invisibility.
Armed with the staggering test data from the Sunflower, Commander Peter Gretton marched into the heart of the Admiralty's resistance. An emergency meeting in London with Rear Admiral Sir Max Horton, the formidable commander-in-chief of Western approaches. In a calculated, provocative move, Gretton brought Tommy Lawson. The sight of the young American merchant cook in a simple pea coat amidst the gold braid and polished leather of the Admiralty boardroom caused visible consternation. Horton, a legendary submariner from the First World War, known for his icy pragmatism, entered with his senior staff, including the chief naval architect, Dr. Harold Burris, the very author of the memo declaring acoustic dampening impossible. Gretton presented the facts. Detection range slashed from 12 miles to 400 yards. The room erupted. "This is preposterous," Burris snapped, directing his fury at the interloper. "You've conducted unauthorized modifications based on the suggestion of forgive me, a cook." Lawson's reply was a volley across the bows. "A cook who understands practical acoustics better than your entire department, it seems." The clash was no longer about data, but about hierarchy, credentials, and the very definition of expertise in a total war. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Lawson was ordered to explain. Speaking plainly, without scientific jargon, he described water as a vibration barrier. Dr. Burris countered with a torrent of technical objections: weight distribution, stability, corrosion. "One test, under controlled conditions," he scoffed, dismissing the evidence. Admiral Horton, who had listened in granite silence, finally raised a hand. He fixed his gaze on Lawson. What would it take to retrofit a convoy? The question, posed to the cook, was a seismic shift. Captain Rushbrook, the director of naval intelligence, argued they couldn't divert resources on a cook's fantasy. But then Lawson, finding a steely calm, delivered the masterstroke. "It doesn't take 6 weeks, sir. The prototype took 3 days. It's not complex engineering. And you don't need to retrofit every ship, just enough to test it in a real convoy." He reframed the massive, paralyzing problem into a simple, manageable experiment. Horton stood, walked to the window, and stared at the gray Thames, symbol of Britain's lifeline. He turned, his decision made. Gretton would retrofit 6 ships in the next outbound convoy. Lawson would supervise. Dr. Burris would provide support, however grudgingly. "If it works, we implement fleet-wide," Horton stated. "If it fails, Commander, you'll spend the rest of the war sweeping mines off the Orkneys." Then he looked at Lawson, the outsider who had stormed the Citadel. "Mr. Lawson, I don't know if you're a genius or a madman, but we are desperate. Don't make me regret this." The experiment, codenamed Operation Silent Run, commenced in the frantic atmosphere of Liverpool's docks on April 11, 1943. 6 Liberty ships, including Lawson's own William Eustace, were fitted with the crude but effective system. Sealed steel chambers around their propeller shafts and water-filled bladders against engine mounts. The work took just 64 hours per vessel, a fraction of the time experts had claimed. By April 22nd, these 6 silent giants were dispersed within the 43-ship convoy ONS 184, steaming into the U-boat-infested mid-Atlantic. No one in the convoy, not even the Commodore, was told which ships were modified or why. This was the ultimate blind test. Meanwhile, German B-Dienst intelligence had tracked the convoy's departure, and Fähnrich Wolfpack, a group of 37 U-boats, fanned out across its predicted route. The stage was set for a brutal, real-world validation, where failure meant fiery death in the icy water. The clash came in the early hours of April 25th. Aboard U-264, Kapitänleutnant Hartwig Lux was baffled. His hydrophone operator reported a chaotic acoustic picture.
Some merchant ships thundered loudly from 40 kilometers away, while others seemed to fade in and out, with 6 specific contacts remaining eerily silent at ranges beyond 5 kilometers. Unable to coordinate a coherent attack on a convoy he could only partially hear, Lux could only target the loudest signatures. Over the next 18 hours, Fähnrich Wolfpack unleashed a devastating assault, sinking 9 merchant ships in a storm of torpedo explosions and despair. It was a heavy, tragic loss. Yet, when the smoke cleared and the survivors were counted, a single monumental fact emerged. Every one of the 9 ships sent to the bottom was unmodified. All 6 of Lawson's acoustically dampened vessels, despite being in the heart of the formation, had slipped through the Wolfpack undetected and untouched. They arrived in New York without a scratch. The signal from Commander Gretland to London was triumphant and unequivocal. The system worked under fire. The Cook's idea had just passed its bloodiest exam, providing the first hard evidence that the acoustic tide could be turned.
The success of the ONS-184 experiment unleashed a revolution with the urgency of a naval broadside. The statistics, once so grim, flipped with breathtaking speed. In the Black May of 1943, the Allies sank a staggering 41 U-boats, 25% of Germany's operational fleet, while merchant losses plummeted. The reason was simple. Lawson's system, now rapidly installed across the convoy fleet, had turned the ocean silent for the hunters. U-boats that once heard convoys from 50 miles away now had to blunder within half a mile, placing them directly in the killing zones of escort radar, ASDIC, and deck guns. Wolfpack tactics, dependent on stealthy coordination, collapsed. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote in despair, "The enemy has robbed the U-boat of its most effective weapon, surprise." From May to December 1943, over 800 ships received the modification. Losses fell by 85%, and U-boat kills quadrupled. The technological tide had turned, not with a complex secret weapon, but with a simple principle of physics applied by a man the experts had dismissed. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't over, but the path to victory was now clear. For Thomas Patrick Lawson, victory was followed by a quiet return to obscurity. Awarded the British Empire Medal in a private ceremony, he refused all publicity, telling the New York Times, "I just noticed something and mentioned it." He returned to Boston, married, and opened a small diner in Dorchester, his wartime role unknown even to his neighbors. When he died in 1991, his obituary read simply, "Retired restaurant owner." Yet his legacy sailed on. The principle of his water-filled chambers evolved into the advanced prairie masker air bubble systems used by modern navies to cloak ships from acoustic torpedoes. His story entered the curriculum of the U.S. Naval Academy as a lesson in disruptive innovation, that the solution to an existential threat can come from the most unexpected observer, and that the courage to challenge a fatal consensus is the most powerful weapon of all. At his funeral, 3 old men in blazers stood apart, British convoy veterans who had survived 1943. One slipped a note into the casket that read, "Because of you, we came home." It was the only epitaph the humble cook would have needed, a quiet testament that he had indeed silenced the sea.